When he heard the splash, he thought it was a beaver at first. But when he turned and saw that it wasn't a beaver but his grandson, his vision went dark. Because he realized, he wouldn't come up on his own. The sun was bleeding into the treetops, painting the riverbank gold as Mark and his 6-year-old grandson, Tommy, ambled down the narrow trail. The air smelled of damp pine needles and approaching dusk. Mark's boots crunched softly against the fallen leaves, his mind drifting to memories of his own father bringing him here long ago. He wanted Tommy to know this place, its hush, its secrets, its wildness. Tommy raced ahead, brandishing a long stick like a makeshift lance, his laughter echoing over the water. The child's small form darted between birch trunks, fearless and bright-eyed. Mark watched him, chest swelling with pride, until the path curved and Tommy slipped out of view. He called his name, but only the wind answered. He stepped onto the bank and paused, scanning the rippling water. A sudden sound, sharp and urgent, tore him from his thoughts. A heavy splash near the shore could have been a beaver's tail or a fish breaching the surface. Mark frowned and glanced back at the trees, expecting to see Tommy's silhouette against the fading light. Instead, there was only the raging river. A second, crazier splash. His heart jolted. He spun around, and there was no boy. Neither behind him nor on the bank. His breath hitched. The river hissed and churned, an angry serpent in the cold twilight. Mark's boots lost purchase on the moss-slick rock. His weight shifted, the world tilted. He reached out, knuckles white, but his foot slipped. Pain shot through his hand as it slammed against a jagged stone and he heard a sickening crack, his finger. He dropped to one knee, breath searing his lungs, and hissed. For a heartbeat, panic paralyzed him. He pressed his hand to his mouth, trying to choke back a scream. The river snatched Tommy like it had planned this all along, swift and merciless. He fumbled for his phone, but the screen only showed the darkening sky. No signal. Of course not. This was the wilderness. This place where cell towers dare not tread. He crawled forward on his good knee, every movement tearing at raw flesh. The water foamed at the river's throat, whitecaps leaping rocks downstream. Mark crawled another few feet, each shift of his injured hand stabbing agony up his arm. He looked downstream, nothing but rushing water, a swirling ribbon of gray and black. His grandson's red woolen cap had been bobbing just moments ago, he could have sworn it floated like a tiny buoy. Now even that was gone. I saw his cap drifting by, he whispered, voice trembling. But then, it vanished. The words trembled in the air. His own voice sounded foreign, cracked with disbelief. He pressed his palm to the cool earth, chest heaving. The river roared, indifferent to the terror it had wrought. He tried to steady his breathing, forcing himself to think. Tommy's laughter. His little hands grabbing sticks. The way his eyes sparkled when discovering a frog or chasing fireflies. The last thing he had seen was that cap, bright as a warning flare, drifting toward the rapids. Mark forced himself to stand, ignoring the agony in his finger and knee. He staggered along the bank, calling, "Tommy! Tommy, can you hear me?" His voice cracked like thin ice. Silence answered. The sky had darkened to bruised purple. Shadows gathered in the woods. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps, like a child calling for help. But the woods gave him only eerie emptiness. He blinked back tears, he could not let panic win. He could not let despair take the only chance he had to find Tommy alive. He squinted upstream, hunting for any sign, a flailing arm, a splash, a stray cry. The river's current mocked him. It barreled forward, unconcerned. Yet somewhere ahead, Tommy might still be clinging to driftwood or islets of brush. Mark took a trembling step, then another, inching forward as if the ground itself might swallow him. A sudden clear note of fear pierced the air. Not his own, but a small voice, distant and trembling. "Grandpa." He froze, heart pounding so violently it seemed to burst his ribs. The sound came again, fragile, desperate. He stumbled toward the sound, voice echoing, "I'm here. I'm coming." Branches whipped his face as he plunged into thick undergrowth, thrashing toward the cry. Panic propelled him past the pain. He burst through a stand of alder and gasped. There, on a flat rock just above the waterline, sat Tommy, soaked to the waist, chattering teeth visible in the dim light. Mark lunged, his good knee buckling, but he caught Tommy's arm before the boy could slip back into the current. He pulled him close, cradling him as tears blurred his vision. Tommy's lips were blue, but his eyes were wide with shock, relief, and something else, amazement. Mark wrapped his jacket around the child and kissed the top of his head. "It's okay, son. I've got you." But as he spoke, a strange stillness fell over the clearing. The rushing water seemed to hush. Mark froze, ears straining. And through the silver mist rising from the riverbank came a sound unlike any he had heard that evening, a low, soft padding on wet rock. He held Tommy tighter and turned slowly, dread coiling in his gut. Ahead, framed by the last rays of dying light, was a pair of golden eyes. Not a beaver. Not a fish. A lynx, its tufted ears flicking, its body large and silent as a ghost. It watched them for a long, breath-stealing moment. Mark's heart thundered. He felt as though the world had flipped on its axis. He swallowed, throat dry. The lynx tilted its head, as if measuring him. Then it took a step forward, no, 3 steps, and came to rest beside Tommy, close enough that Mark could see the delicate curve of its whiskers. Mark bit back a scream. His mind screamed, "Run! Hide! Scream! Save your son!" But his body wouldn't move. The lynx sat down on its haunches, eyes steady, and for a second Mark saw something in them, intelligence, compassion, guardianship. He loosened his grip on Tommy, who gazed back at the wild cat as if recognizing a friend. Mark's voice caught in his throat. He dared not breathe too loudly, but he whispered, "I saw his cap, and then it was gone." The lynx turned its head toward the river and fixed Mark with that same knowing stare. It stretched, stood, and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving behind a hush deeper than silence. Mark pressed Tommy against him and trembled. He did not understand what had just happened. He did not dare try. All he knew was that something impossible had just unfolded on the riverbank, and he would never, ever forget it. When he realized someone stirred in the brush, he expected a bear. But when he saw the lynx in the moonlight, his blood ran cold. And then, it ran cold in a way he could never have imagined. Mark pressed his wounded leg against a mossy boulder, every movement a fresh flare of pain. The night had closed in around him, a vault of ink and silver, and the only sound he could hear was the distant rush of the river. He called Tommy's name again, voice raw and desperate, but only the wind answered. He forced himself to limp forward, each step dragging him closer to the river's edge. The damp chill gnawed at his bones, and dark clouds scudded overhead, blotting out the stars. He toppled over a tangle of roots, his ankle twisting beneath him. A sharp stab of agony shot up his leg, and he cursed under his breath, tasting blood in his mouth. Fear crashed into him. In that moment, he convinced himself the worst was yet to come, some massive creature drawn by the boy's cries, a bear or wolf, prowling in wait. He staggered upright, leaning on a fallen log to steady himself. He peered into the gloom, scanning the tree line, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it would burst through his ribs. Then he heard it again, soft, deliberate padding. Something moved just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. He squinted, trying to make out a shape in the uneven swirl of shadows and moonlight. His pulse hammered in his temples. He swallowed hard and called, "Tommy, I'm here." His voice cracked, echoing among the pines. The padding stopped. And then, a pair of eyes glowed, wide and unblinking. Mark's breath caught. He stepped closer, every nerve on fire. He expected a low rumble, a roar, something primal and terrifying. Instead, the shape unfolded into the unmistakable silhouette of the lynx he had seen earlier. It emerged from the undergrowth, majestic and silent, its tufted ears quivering as if attuned to some hidden frequency. It did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. It simply stood there, its body a perfect still life against the churning darkness. Mark's fear clashed with bewilderment. How could a wild cat so colossal and dangerous behave like this? He raised a trembling hand, half to defend himself, half to beckon it away. "Go back," he whispered, voice hoarse. "You're wild. You'll kill us both." But the lynx did not budge. Instead, it took a slow step forward, then another, until it was barely 10 feet away. The moonlight danced across its tawny fur, highlighting the powerful muscles beneath. Mark swallowed, eyes locked with the animal's. He saw no malice there, only curiosity, and something deeper, something almost reverent. His heart pounded. He thought, this has to be the moment. Any instant now, it will leap at me. His muscles tensed for flight, but his body refused to obey. He felt rooted to the spot. Then, against every instinct screaming in his mind, the lynx turned on its haunches and began to walk away, along the riverbank, its gaze flicking back toward him as if to say, "Follow." Mark blinked. His breath hitched. He lowered himself carefully, using the log as a crutch, and hobbled after the animal. The path it chose was narrow and treacherous, slick stones, gnarled roots, the river's roaring edge. Each step sent pain lancing through his leg, but he forced himself onward. "Wait," he called softly, voice trembling. "I can't keep up." The lynx paused, its head tilted in that strange, knowing way. It waited, ears perked, then continued. Mark stumbled, caught himself with one hand on the cold ground, then pushed forward again. His mind raced, was it leading him to Tommy? Could this incredible cat really understand? The moon broke through a gap in the clouds, illuminating a narrow spit of rock jutting into the river. There, curled against a driftwood log, sat Tommy, shivering, but awake, eyes fixed on the cat. Mark's chest clenched. Relief and disbelief collided in his gut. He would have wept then, if he could have spared the breath. He hobbled toward them, voice breaking, "Tommy." Tommy looked up, eyes bright with astonishment. He whispered, "Grandpa, she brought me." Mark reached his grandson's side and knelt, pressing a trembling hand to the boy's shoulder. The cold had drained all color from Tommy's face, but his eyes shone with wonder. "Thank you," Mark whispered, voice barely audible. He glanced at the lynx, expecting it to vanish like a phantom. Instead, the cat sat quietly, tail curled around its paws. It did not growl or bare its claws. It simply regarded them both. Mark felt his fear ebbing, replaced by awe so profound his breath caught again. The air around them seemed to still, as though the forest itself held its breath. But then Mark noticed movement downstream, a log, snagged in the rapids, twisting toward open water. His heart leaped. "Tommy, look," he hissed. "That log could smash you." Tommy's eyes flicked from the lynx to the river. The cat's ears swiveled, and for a moment Mark thought it might dart forward to push the boy out of harm's way. Yet it remained motionless, watching. Mark's panic returned. He half rose, ready to carry Tommy to safety. But the lynx stood and padded ahead of him, into the shallow river shallows. It approached the log, placed a single massive paw on it, and nudged it, just enough to change its angle. The log yawed away from Tommy's rock and crashed into the opposite bank with a deafening crack. Mark gasped. He had never seen such intelligence or precision in a wild animal. His fear melted into gratitude, and he sank to his knees in the cold water, pulling Tommy close. The boy wrapped his arms around his grandfather's neck, and they both stared at the lynx, whose work was done. Mark's voice trembled with emotion. "I thought you'd kill us. But you saved him." The lynx met his gaze one last time, as though acknowledging his words, then turned and vanished silently into the moonlit forest. Mark pressed his forehead to Tommy's hair, tears streaking down his cheeks. He could barely believe what he had witnessed. And as the river's roar wrapped them in its eternal song, he knew this was only the beginning of something he could never explain, and would never forget. She looked at him as if he were her own. As if she understood whom he was searching for. He didn't know what to do, but he followed her. Because his heart told him, believe her. Mark's leg throbbed like a bell tolling in his bones as he bent to press his palm against the jagged stone that had cut him. Every breath sent fresh waves of pain racing up his thigh, but he forced himself to stand. The lynx, its tawny fur rippling in the moonlight, had paused again, ears twitching, as if beckoning him onward. He squared his shoulders, refusing to let fear, or agony, break him. He took a tentative step, planting his good foot firmly, and limped after the animal into a tangle of birch and alder. The shrubs closed around him like cathedral walls, dripping with dew. He wiped a line of sweat and blood from his brow. Behind him, the river's roar was a constant reminder of the stakes, every second counted. The lynx stopped beneath an arch of low-hanging branches and turned. Its golden eyes met his for a long, breathless moment. No ferocity there, only a patient insistence. Mark swallowed hard. He raised his hand in a half-salute, half-plea, and the lynx tilted its head once, then padded forward again. He followed through the undergrowth, heart pounding so fiercely he thought it might burst free of his chest. The beast moved with ghost-like grace, paw by paw, silent on the moss, but Mark's gait was heavy, uneven. Several times he stumbled, pinning a finger under a root or twisting his ankle in a muddy hollow. Each time, he paused, fighting back tears as raw pain flared. But always the lynx waited at the next clearing, eyes locked on him, urging him onward. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged onto a narrow ledge above a hidden bend in the river. There, in the shallow, glassy water, lay Tommy. His small body was sprawled on a bed of smooth stones, soaked through, but astonishingly still. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Tommy," he rasped, stumbling forward. His fingers trembled as he reached for the boy's shoulder. Tommy's head lolled, hair plastered to his forehead, but his chest rose and fell in shallow, rhythmic sobs. Relief hammered through Mark's veins like hot fire. He knelt beside him, brushing wet curls from the boy's eyes. Tommy bolted up and threw his arms around Mark's neck. "Grandpa," he whimpered, voice tiny. "I thought I was alone." Mark's tears spilled unchecked. He hugged him tight, pressing his cheek to Tommy's damp hair. "You're safe," he whispered, voice cracking. "I've got you." He glanced back, expecting the lynx to vanish now that its task was done. But the cat remained at the water's edge, body poised on silent haunches, tail curled neatly around its paws. Its eyes were fixed on Mark, and in them he saw something he could not name, recognition, perhaps, or quiet approval. Tommy clung to his grandfather, chattering with relief. Mark felt a tremor of triumph. He had found his grandson against all odds. He half-lifted Tommy in his arms, preparing to head back up the bank, when a sudden chill slithered down his spine. He looked again at the lynx. Its gaze had shifted beyond them, toward the river's roaring center, where jagged rocks lay hidden beneath the churning foam. He followed the cat's stare and saw, to his horror, a large branch drifting into the rapids. With a crack of wood against stone, It snagged on a submerged boulder, then lurched free. Mark's heart began to pound erratically. He set Tommy gently on the stones. "Stay here," he said, voice trembling, and scrambled to the water's edge. The branch had shifted again, now spinning toward a narrow channel where the current funneled with deadly speed. He reached a hand out, only inches from the swirling wood, too far to grasp it, too dangerous to ignore. He grabbed a nearby branch for leverage, bracing himself against the icy surge. Behind him, Tommy's sobs caught in his throat, a pitiful sound that twisted Mark's guts. He lunged, fingertips brushing the wood, but the river yanked it away. He cursed under his breath and braced himself, ready to dive in after it, when a blurred shape rocketed through the foam. The lynx had leaped into the current, body slicing through the wave. With impossible speed it caught the branch between its massive jaws, then hauled it toward the bank, teeth clamped tight. Water cascaded from its pelt as it dragged the log clear of the rapids and back onto the shallows. Mark staggered forward, stunned, as the animal hauled the branch aside and padded back to his grandson's side, shaking droplets into the air like a benediction. He swallowed, voice hollow. How did you know?" The lynx simply gazed at him a moment longer, then turned and vanished into the darkness of the forest, leaving only the echo of its silent departure. Mark sank to his knees in the shallows, water swirling around him. Tommy ran into his arms, eyes wide with wonder. The moon peeked from behind a cloud, bathing them in pale light. Mark held his grandson tight, tears streaming down his face. He thought, "This is it. He found him. They were safe." But nature was planning something entirely different. He couldn't find words as Tommy wept against his chest. And only the lynx sat beside them, motionless as bedrock. Its eyes were ancient, like those of an old, wise soul. Mark pressed his shaking hands to Tommy's shoulders, trying to stanch the boy's chattering teeth. He wrapped his jacket around the child's drenched frame, tucking the fabric snug under the boy's chin. The night pressed in close, a moonless sky, wind whispering through the pines, and the distant thunder of the river. He gathered fallen branches and dry pine needles, coaxing a small fire that crackled to life between two flat stones. Warmth bloomed in the clearing, sending sparks toward the treetops. Tommy's tears sputtered in the glow, turning to steam on his cheeks. Mark brushed the boy's hair back and murmured, "Warm now, buddy. You'll be all right." Behind him, in the haze of smoke and flickering light, the lynx remained. It had followed them up from the water's edge, its paws leaving soft imprints on the damp earth. Now it lay curled beside the fire, its head resting on massive forepaws. Mark felt Tommy's gaze on the animal, the boy sniffled, then laid his head against his grandfather's side, watching the wild cat with wide, uneasy eyes. Mark glanced back. The animal's fur gleamed in the firelight, each individual hair tipped with burnished gold. Its tufted ears flicked at every crackle. Mark swallowed. He expected it to bolt into the shadows at any moment, expected that, at the first sign of flames, it would bolt away in fear. But it did not. Instead, the lynx settled more deeply, tail curling like a question mark around its haunches. It closed its eyes, then opened them again, blinking slowly. Mark could almost swear that its gaze shifted between him and Tommy as though it were gauging their temperature, their state, their need. He crouched a few feet away, hands resting on his knees. His wounded leg throbbed, but he dared not move too fast, for fear of scaring Tommy, fear of startling the lynx. The flames danced, throwing shadows that made the clearing seem alive with movement. But the lynx remained still, a sentinel in the fire's embrace. Tommy shivered and Mark drew him closer. The boy's tears had dried, leaving streaks of grit on his cheeks. The child whispered, "Grandpa, why is she here?" Mark hesitated, searching for words. He looked at the lynx, its whiskers twitching in the smoky air. Never had he felt such raw presence from a wild creature. I don't know, he said softly. But she's protecting us. Tommy poked at a glowing ember with a stick. The fire hissed, and he jumped, glancing toward the lynx. The cat's ears twitched in response, but it did not flinch. It simply opened its eyes and fixed them on Tommy. In that moment, Mark felt something profound stir in him, a conviction that the animal understood more than any human could. He moved closer, reaching out a cautious hand. The lynx lifted its head, revealing the curve of its neck and the strength coiled beneath its fur. Mark stopped, fingertips half an inch from the pelt. He dared not touch, it felt too sacred, too impossible. Around them, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The acrid scent of pine smoke and wet earth seeped into Mark's lungs. Tommy yawned, exhaustion finally catching him. Mark scooped the boy into his arms and rocked him gently. Above them, the treetops swayed in rhythm with the wind. The fire crackled its lullaby. And the lynx, still watching, closed its eyes and lay its head back on its paws, as though settling in for the long vigil. Mark's throat tightened. He whispered, "Why don't you leave, girl? Don't you know fire can kill you?" Silence answered. The only reply was the murmur of the river beyond the trees and the soft rasp of the wind. The lynx did not stir. It did not flee. Mark's heart hammered. He pressed a hand to his chest. He had seen wild cats before, but never like this. Never one that stayed by a stranger's side, never one that braved open flame and human presence without aggression. Questions crowded his mind, each more impossible than the last. Why had she led him here? Why had she saved Tommy? Why did she not fear the blaze? He glanced at the boy, whose breathing had slowed into a peaceful rhythm. Tommy's head lolled against Mark's shoulder, eyelashes dark against pale skin. The child was asleep. And still the lynx remained, a guardian in the dark. Mark stared into the flickering light, every muscle trembling. The animal's steady, unblinking vigil etched itself into his memory. He felt the night deepen around him, the forest leaning in to witness. And then, as though sharing a silent vow, the lynx lifted its head, gazed once more at the sleeping boy, and exhaled a quiet, rumbling breath. Its chest rose and fell in the amber glow. Mark whispered, voice thick with wonder, "I don't understand any of this." The lynx blinked. And in those ancient eyes, Mark felt the echo of a promise, that until dawn broke and the fire died to embers, they would not be alone. Why did she stay? Why did she face the flame? The night held its secrets close, but Mark knew he would spend the rest of his life seeking their answer. He remembered his grandfather's words as if they'd been whispered into his ear just moments ago, "There's a cat in the taiga, but not just any cat. She knows who you are. And if she accepts you, she might just save your life." Mark's mind flickered back to summers long ago, when he'd sat beside that same grandfather on a rickety porch overlooking a wider, gentler river. His grandfather had leaned forward, eyes soft but gleaming with something uncanny, and told him tales of the taiga's watchful cats, creatures that appeared in times of peril and vanished at dawn, leaving behind only footprints and wonder. Mark had been a boy then, enthralled but skeptical. Now, crouched beside a dying fire and feeling the lynx's gaze upon them, he understood the old man's conviction. The lynx shifted beside Tommy, lifting a massive paw and laying it gently on the damp earth. It did not touch the boy, the paw hovered an inch away, a silent blessing. Tommy's eyelids fluttered, and the cat's head tilted, as though acknowledging the boy's stirring awareness. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He saw the lynx's whiskers tremble in the smoky air, heard the faint click of its claws against the stone hearth. In that moment, the memory and the reality merged. "There's a cat in the taiga," his grandfather had said, voice low, "that knows when one of our family walks these woods. If she deems you worthy, she will stand guard when you cannot stand for yourself." Mark had laughed then, thinking it a fairy tale. But now the lynx sat so close that Mark could almost feel the warmth of its fur. Its golden eyes, aged and inscrutable, tracked every flicker of flame and every tremor of Tommy's breathing. He reached out, tentatively, to brush a lock of Tommy's hair back. The lynx followed the motion with its gaze, and Mark imagined it understanding more than any human could. He remembered how his grandfather had described the cat's amber eyes as windows to a soul older than any human memory. Mark glanced at the lynx now and saw, in that gaze, centuries of knowing, of lives saved, of secrets kept. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant snowfields. Mark felt a shiver, not of cold, but of awe. He shook his head, impossible emotions surging, gratitude, reverence, disbelief. The lynx lay there, stern and unmoving, a living monument to the wild's hidden mercy. Tommy stirred and mumbled something indistinct in his sleep. The cat lowered its paw, then pressed it gently to the boy's shoulder, an almost imperceptible brush. Mark's heart seized. He steadied himself against a chunk of cedar bark, eyes watering. It was as if someone had sent her from the sky, he thought, voice echoing inside his mind. As if she knew us. He whispered the words aloud. The lynx rattled its tail once, then closed its eyes as though in contentment. The fire sputtered and sparks danced around its ears. For a heartbeat, Mark dared to believe that the animal truly understood the family bond, knew the urgency of a grandfather's love, the fragility of a child in peril. He stood slowly, leg protesting with every inch. The lynx blinked open its eyes, fixed on him with that same ancient calm. Mark held up a hand in silent thanks. The cat nodded ever so slightly, as if granting permission, or bestowing blessing. Around them, the forest loomed dark and immense. Mark realized that, for all its vastness, it had yielded its secret, that unseen guardians prowled its depths. He felt a swell of emotion, fear turned to faith, astonishment to gratitude. He crouched again beside Tommy, wrapping an arm around the boy's shoulders and smoothing his hair. The lynx watched, and in that watchful stance, Mark recognized the fulfillment of his grandfather's promise. It was inconceivable, he thought, chest tightening. But there she was, just like Grandpa said. The lynx lowered its head to rest on crossed paws, eyes never leaving the sleeping child. Mark felt tears slip down his cheeks. He pressed his fingers to his lips, eyes fixed on the animal whose intervention had made all the difference. In that silent communion, Mark understood at last, the taiga's mysteries were real. Its ancient wisdom lived in the lynx's heart. And for this night, they were under her protection. He whispered to the darkness, "Thank you," and felt, deep in his soul, that the lynx had heard him. Then, closing his eyes, he allowed himself a single, unguarded tear, and the first true peace he'd known since Tommy slipped beneath the icy current. He lay beside the dying embers of the fire, every muscle coiled with exhaustion and fear. The night pressed in around him like a closing fist. Tommy slept fitfully against his chest, shoulders rising and falling in shallow breaths. Mark's eyelids fluttered, weighted with the promise of sleep, and horror. He dared not close his eyes. Every time he tried, he imagined waking to emptiness, the boy gone, the lynx vanished, the forest reclaiming its prey. His heart pounded so fiercely that he heard it thrum in his ears. He swallowed and willed his breathing to slow. Behind him, the lynx lay watchful, its chest rising in steady, rhythmic gulps. The animal's silhouette was a living shadow against the blackness. Mark felt its gaze sweep the perimeter, as if the cat itself were a living barrier between them and unimaginable threats beyond. He shifted slightly, careful not to stir Tommy, and reached for a log to stoke the embers. The fire flared, sending a soft glow across the clearing. The lynx's eyes glinted in that glow, ancient orbs reflecting something older than memory. Mark exhaled. He felt a flicker of warmth, not from the flames, but from the knowledge that they were not alone. Every crack in the underbrush, every rustle of wind through leaves, made him flinch. But the lynx did not move. It simply opened one eye, then closed it, as though listening to the secrets whispered by the forest floor. Mark's thoughts spiraled. Bears might roam here. Wolves might circle. Even the river could claim us all by morning. He pressed his hand against Tommy's back, feeling the soft rise and fall of the boy's breath. He closed his eyes for a fleeting second and imagined the lynx slipping away. His heart lurched, and he opened them again. The cat was still there, unwavering. He leaned forward and patted the dry earth beside the fire. "Thank you," he whispered, voice raw. "Thank you for staying." The lynx's ears twitched. It lifted its head, whiskers trembling in the glow. For a moment, Mark thought it would speak in its own silent language, untranslatable, but clear. Instead, it lay down again, abandoning any pretense of fear. Mark shifted ancient logs to comfort the flames, but smoke stung his eyes. He blinked until the tears blurred the clearing. He glanced at Tommy, still sleeping, safe for now. He dared to close his eyes again. He imagined morning light filtering through the pines, the chill lifting, the river gentle once more. He imagined the lynx melting back into the forest while he and Tommy stumbled home. And then, a low growl rolled through the darkness beyond the firelight. Mark jolted upright. His heart thundered. Tommy stirred, eyelids trembling. The lynx's head shot up, ears flat, muscles coiling. Mark's breath caught. His skin prickled. He felt every hair on his arm stand at attention. The growl deepened, resonant and warning. Something moved beyond the circle of light, an unseen shape skirting the edge of the clearing. The lynx rose, body fluid as water, and stepped between Mark and the darkness. Its fur bristled, back arching in silent fury. Mark felt frozen. He clutched Tommy protectively, whispering, "It's okay, it's okay." But his voice trembled. He could not tear his eyes from the shifting shadows. The unknown thing passed. A branch snapped. Leaves rustled in a frantic hush. The lynx snarled low, baring its teeth in a feral promise of defense. Its posture was regal and terrible. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, the lynx relaxed. It let out a single, soft chuff, a feline sigh of relief, and settled back onto its haunches. The growl faded into the night, swallowed by the river's roar. Mark's knees gave way. He sank beside the fire, his body trembling like a leaf in a storm. He pressed Tommy closer, tears wetting the boy's hair. He could not find words. His voice was a fractured whisper, "Thank you, for protecting us." The lynx turned its gaze toward him, its eyes calm again, ancient and unreadable. Mark felt his chest unclench. He had wanted the animal gone, feared for its safety, and now realized he would have given anything for its protection. He leaned back, propping himself against a log, and stared into the fire. The world felt impossibly vast, and somehow, alive with silent guardians. He closed his eyes for a third time, trusting that this time, the lynx would not abandon them. In the blackness beyond the fire's halo, he sensed movement, but fear no longer gripped him. He knew the lynx would stand between them and whatever lurked in the shadows. Mark's breathing evened. He drifted toward sleep, the lynx's steady presence like a lullaby. He thought, for sure, that this was the end of their ordeal. That with the cat's vigilance, they were safe until dawn. But no. She stayed. The first pale rays of dawn filtered through the pines, dappling the clearing in soft gold. Mark stirred, shoulders aching from the night's vigil, and blinked against the gentle light. Beside him, Tommy lay sleeping, his breath slow and even at last. Mark rose on aching limbs and stretched, testing his leg. The pain was nothing compared to relief, nothing compared to gratitude. He glanced around the circle of stones where their small fire had burned itself to gray ashes. And there, standing sentinel at the very edge of the clearing, was the lynx. The cat's coat was muted in morning light, soft tawny fur with ghostly silver streaks, but its posture was unmistakable, statuesque, watchful, unwavering. It looked less like an animal and more like a guardian carved from living stone. Mark swallowed, heart pounding with emotion he could barely name. He crouched beside Tommy and brushed damp hair from the boy's forehead. The child stirred and opened wide eyes, still heavy with sleep and wonder. "Grandpa," Tommy yawned, voice small. "Good morning, buddy," Mark whispered, voice thick. He lifted Tommy into his arms and pulled him close. The boy rested his head on Mark's shoulder, blinking up at him. Tommy's gaze drifted to the lynx. His eyes grew round. He pointed with a small, trembling finger. "Look, Grandpa." Mark turned his own head and met the lynx's steady stare. He reminded himself to breathe. The cat did not flinch. It simply watched, ears pricked, as if ensuring no harm would come to its two wards. Mark whispered, "She's still here." His voice cracked on the final word. Tommy slid from his arms and stood, wrapping his small body in Mark's jacket. He took a step forward, then another, until he was only a few feet from the great cat. The lynx's ears flicked, but it made no move to retreat. "Thank you," Tommy said in a tiny, clear voice, an echo of his grandfather's words from the night before. And then, in the sweetest, most awestruck tone, he added, "She was kind. She hugged me." Mark's chest clenched. He could feel tears welling. The boy's simple innocence, the cat's impossible compassion, it was too much. He bent to scoop Tommy back into his arms. The child gripped him tightly. Mark pressed a kiss to Tommy's temple. He glanced again at the lynx. Tommy waved, small hand trembling with emotion. "Bye," he called quietly. For a heartbeat, the lynx simply sat, head held high, golden eyes soft. Then, without a sound, it rose. Muscles rippled beneath its fur as it stretched, and it turned away from them. Mark held his breath. He watched as the cat's form slipped between the tree trunks, moving deeper into the forest. The hush of dawn swallowed its paws, and in an instant, it was gone. Tommy buried his face in Mark's neck, quiet sobs vibrating against him. "She hugged me," he whispered again. Mark nuzzled his scalp, unable to stop the tears that slid down his cheeks. He wrapped both arms around Tommy and closed his eyes, tasting the faint scent of pine and dew. They stood there for long minutes, the clearing empty but for two figures clutching each other and the faint, lingering echo of a miracle. The river beyond whispered as always, but now it sounded kinder, like it, too, honored what had happened here. Mark finally set Tommy down and took his hand. Together, they turned back toward the trail that would lead them home. Mark paused at the edge of the clearing, looking once more into the silent forest. "I saw her," he murmured to the trees, voice thick with reverence. "I saw her save you." Tommy squeezed his hand. "She wasn't just a wild cat," the boy said softly. She was our friend." Mark swallowed around a lump in his throat. He nodded, unable to speak. Then, with one last look at the empty clearing, he turned and walked into the golden morning, his grandson's small hand warm in his own, and his heart forever changed by the kindness of a lynx. He returned to the city with his grandson cradled in his arms, the early sun gilding rooftops he no longer saw. The tires of his dusty truck rolled over pavement, a sound so mundane it felt alien after the river's roar. Traffic lights blinked, horns honked, people hurried past storefronts, but Mark's world had narrowed to a single, echoing memory, the lynx's steady gaze at dawn. At home, he set Tommy on the couch, wrapped him in a warm blanket, and watched as the boy drifted into sleep. The house felt impossibly quiet, its walls too close, its air stale compared to the pine-scented breeze of the taiga. Mark wandered through rooms filled with framed photographs, family smiles frozen in time, but none captured what he had seen in the wilderness. None showed the cat's amber eyes or the way its fur glowed in firelight. He sank into his favorite chair, hands clasped loosely on his lap. City life hummed around him, the hum of air conditioning, the distant rumble of buses, the low voices of neighbors through thin walls. Yet he felt a hollow in his chest, as though a vast emptiness had moved in and taken up residence. Night after night, he replayed the events along the riverbank. He saw Tommy slipping beneath the current, heard the panic in his own voice. He felt the jagged stone cutting his hand, the cold snap of fear. And always, he saw the lynx emerge from the shadows, first a shape in the moonlight, then a living promise of mercy. He remembered the animal's silent command, believe. He followed, through brambles and pain, until he found his grandson clinging to wet rocks. He remembered the cat's impossible intelligence, nudging a deadly log clear of the rapids as if it understood every nuance of danger. Then the fire, the vigil, the tremor of fear when something growled at the edge of their refuge. And the lynx rising between them and the dark, a living shield. Mark rocked in his chair, exhaustion and adrenaline tangled in his veins. He longed for rest, but sleep felt treacherous. He feared that if he closed his eyes, he would wake to find Tommy gone, the lynx vanished, the night's miracle revealed as a dream. He rose and paced the living room, heart pounding with memories. The city's neon glow seeped through curtained windows, casting strange shadows on the walls. He could almost see tufted ears flicking in those shadows, hear the soft click of paws on wood. He pressed his palms to his eyes, willing the images to fade. But they only grew sharper, the lynx's paw pressed gently beside Tommy's shoulder, the cat's breath mingling with the steam rising from tears on the boy's cheeks. Mark sank to the floor and wrapped his arms around his knees. He felt Tommy's head on his chest, heard his steady breathing. He closed his eyes and whispered into the quiet room, "Maybe I made it all up." A memory surfaced unbidden, his grandfather's voice, low and certain in that porch's dusk light. "If she accepts you, she might just save your life." He had laughed then, thinking it a harmless fanciful story. Now he knew it was truth. He rose, shedding sudden tears, and crossed to the window. The city skyline stretched in jagged lines, indifferent. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and let the tears fall. "I saw it," he whispered, voice broken. "I saw it myself. And since then I know, nature remembers us. And maybe, it even loves us." He stood there, breath misting the pain, repeating the words like an incantation. He closed his eyes and let the confession settle in his bones. Something impossible had happened, and he was charged with its memory. Days passed, and the ache remained. Simple routines, making breakfast, driving to the store, tucking Tommy into bed, felt hollow without the lynx's watchful presence. He found himself drawn to documentaries about wildlife, reading every account of lynx in North America, searching for any stranger's tale of a wild cat acting as guardian. He shared his story online, half expecting doubt or ridicule, but he found a few believers, people who had felt the same ancient pulse in the forest, who had glimpsed something that defied explanation. At night, he tucked Tommy in and whispered, "Do you remember our friend?" The boy would nod, eyes bright in the lamplight. "She was kind," Tommy would say, voice soft. "I felt her hug me." Mark would lie awake afterward, the ceiling dissolving into starlit canopies, until exhaustion finally claimed him. And even then, in dreams, the lynx's silhouette would pass behind him, a silent reassurance. He tried to tell himself life must go on, that the city had its own rhythms, its own pulse. But every honk of a horn sounded like a drum of emptiness. Every rush of wind down an alley recalled the susurrus of the taiga. He found himself driving at dawn, windows down, hoping to catch something wild in the suburban haze, a fox darting between hedges, an owl silhouetted against streetlights. But the world here moved too fast, it had forgotten how to pause, to listen. One evening, Tommy found Mark in the backyard, staring at the dark line of trees beyond the fence. The boy slipped his hand into his grandfather's. "Do you think she's out there?" Mark squeezed the small hand gently. The breeze rustled leaves, and he closed his eyes. For a heartbeat, he could almost hear the soft padding of paws. "I think," he said slowly, "that she'll always be out there, in the wild places where people fear to look. And whenever we need her, she'll come." Tommy smiled, relieved. He leaned against Mark's leg. Mark realized then that his confession was not only a memory but a promise, to never forget, to honor the wild's quiet grace. He took a deep breath, tasting the night air. The city lights shimmered, but in his heart, he carried the taiga's hush, a world where a lynx could choose to protect, where nature might accept and even love. And in that stillness, he found a fragile peace. Even here, even now, he was not alone. If your heart is full of awe, right, nature is wiser than us. If you believe animals remember kindness, right, we are not alone in this world. When he saw the crimson stains marring the snow at the foot of the wooden cross, his vision blurred, because he knew this was no accident. Harlan trudged through the drifts toward the grave of his old hunting partner. The forest lay silent beneath an iron sky, each breath crystallizing in the frigid air. He'd visited this spot every winter since Sam's passing, laying fresh pine boughs, whispering old jokes into the stillness. Today felt no different, until those tracks appeared. Fresh paw prints led through the glistening white, each print edged with bright drops of blood. His heart thundered in his chest as he followed them, crunching through powder until he stood before the grave marker. A simple cross, its wood worn by storms and time, now bore witness to something he never expected. Nestled against the base of the cross lay a red fox, its russet fur matted with blood. She was wounded, flank torn open, yet she didn't flee. Her amber eyes were half-lidded, as if weary of flight, and she lay pressed against the cold wood as though seeking comfort. Harlan froze. He dared not breathe. He was certain the fox would spring away at any moment, any sane creature would. But she stayed, every labored exhale stirring little clouds of steam into the frigid morning. He remembered the stories Sam had told, how, years ago, a young fox had limped into camp with a shattered leg, moving so gingerly he'd thought it was a hallucination. Sam had carried her back to that very clearing, splinted her leg, and nursed her through weeks of fever and frostbite. When she finally limped off into the trees, Sam swore she looked back once and nodded. Harlan had laughed then. A fox, nodding? Ridiculous. But now, watching this injured creature lie at Sam's grave, he felt the laughter die in his throat. He crouched, every muscle taut, and reached out a hand. The fox lifted her head, her gaze fixing on him with a strange recognition, as though she knew exactly who he was. His pulse hammered inside his ears. The wind sighed through the pines, and he sensed the forest itself holding its breath. He remembered Sam's voice, "They remember kindness." He had believed it as a boy, half convinced. Now he understood it was a truth far stranger than any myth. He dared to touch her flank, felt the ragged wound beneath his gloved fingers. His breath caught, blood, ice-cold, seeped beneath his glove. The fox winced but did not pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning into his hand. He swallowed hard, his throat raw. Then she opened her eyes again and peered into his face, as if trying to say something beyond words. Something that trembled between creature and man, gratitude, sorrow, farewell. Harlan stood, respect and awe overcoming any fear. He felt as if he had stepped beyond the bounds of everyday life, into a realm where wildness and grace intertwined. But the air was bitter, and he shivered. Gently, he drew back. The fox's breathing slowed. She pressed her head against the snowy ground, still nestled against the cross. He couldn't tear his eyes away. He thought, surely she will rise. She must. This is where the living go to rest, not the dying. He imagined her gathering strength, pushing herself upright, then slipping into the forest like the ghost of every fox that had ever prowled these woods. He exhaled a shaky sigh. "Go on," he whispered, voice cracking. "Go on home." But she did not move. The forest remained hushed, the snow untouched around her. The bloodstains at her side glowed against the white, and her chest rose and fell with a fragile rhythm. Harlan closed his eyes, grief and wonder warring in his heart. He opened them again and took a step backward. He expected then to see the fox disappear into the trees, leaving only her prints and the memory of kindness behind. But she sank deeper into the snow instead, as if the cold ground were pulling her down into the earth itself. He watched, breath caught in his throat, as her body settled, the last of her warmth fading into the pale light. And Harlan realized that this moment was not a beginning or an end, but a bridge between what was lost and what remains. He let out a long, ragged breath, the only sound in that frozen clearing. He thought it would be over then. But it was only just beginning. He stood a dozen paces away, the frozen ground cracking beneath his boots, and watched the fox as she lay curled beside the cross. Dawn's pale light filtered through skeletal boughs, haloing her wounded form in a fragile glow. Harlan's breath churned in ragged clouds. He dared not move closer, afraid that a single misstep, a stray creak of leather, would send her fleeing or, worse, cause her final breath to catch. He let memories rise, unbidden. Years ago, Sam had returned from one of his solitary hunts carrying something small and trembling against his coat. Harlan remembered the look Sam wore that day, part pity, part resolve. They'd thought it some woodland cub, until Sam knelt and unwrapped the cloth to reveal a fox kit, one hind leg twisted unnaturally, its fur matted with dried blood. Sam's rifle had slung at his shoulder, finger grazing the trigger. He cocked his head, closed his eyes, then shivered and lowered the gun. "I can't," he'd whispered, voice hoarse. "Can't end it like this." The two of them built a makeshift splint from saplings and twine. For nights on end, Sam stayed by the fire, warming the creature with his hand, humming old hunting songs, feeding it broth from a tin cup. Harlan was skeptical at first. He'd seen enough cruelty in those woods to know that wild animals rarely survived close encounters with people. But the kit's eyes, amber and unflinching, had seemed to hold a spark of something untamed and grateful. When the leg healed enough, Sam wrapped the fox in a blanket and carried her to the edge of the clearing. The forest held its breath as he knelt, set her down, and stepped back. The kit sat on a moss-covered rock as if in judgment, tail flicking slowly. Then, in one graceful movement, she turned and vanished into the pines. But she did not vanish far. Day after day, Sam spotted her at dawn, perched on that same rock, watching him with those knowing eyes. She became his silent companion, a guardian spirit of sorts. Harlan had teased him about it, "Your fox friend," he'd said with a grin. But Sam only smiled back, as if Harlan could never understand. Could it be the same one? Harlan whispered to himself now, voice cracking in the cold air. The years had been cruel to him both, Sam taken too soon by heart trouble, and now Harlan's own joints stiff with age and regret. Yet there was something undeniably familiar in the fox's posture, the slow lift of her head when the sun cleared the horizon. He stepped forward, every muscle taut, and dropped to one knee in the snow. His gloved hand hovered over his heart as though expecting it to shatter. The fox watched him, unflinching. Recognition seemed to burn between them, though she had no reason to know him. Stillness held them in a shared moment, man and beast bound by memories neither could fully name. Night fell and the temperature plunged, but sleep eluded Harlan. He lay by the stove in his cabin, images of the cross and the fox's weary eyes dancing behind his eyelids. He dozed in hours-long fits, jolting awake to the howl of wind or the snap of a distant branch. Each time he roused, his heart pounded with the fear that the fox might not still be there when morning came. At first light, he donned his coat and stepped outside. The sky was a sheet of dirty white, and the breath of dawn hung sharp on his tongue. He followed the narrow path through the snow. Every step, he braced himself, certain that the glade would be empty, the scene a trick of last night's fevered mind. But there she waited, as before, curled beside the cross, her flanks still crimson. Her eyes lifted when he approached, and in that gaze lay a depth of understanding that crushed his skepticism. He dropped to his knees a frozen foot from her side, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "I thought it was just a dream," he said. "But see for yourself, here I am, back again." She blinked slowly, ear twitching, as if weighing his words. She did not shift. Did not flee. She remained, body pressed to the cold earth, trusting a human to come near once more. He reached out, fingers brushing snow before touching the fur atop her head. It was rough and cold, but real. Tears burned behind his eyes, tears for Sam, for the fox, for the miracle of their reunion. He remembered every laugh Sam had shared, every tender moment tending that injured kit. He thought of how the fox had repaid Sam's kindness with loyalty and presence, unspoken but undeniable. "I should take you back to the cabin," he murmured. "Let you rest by the fire like he did." But she lifted her head higher, eyes fixed on the cross, then looked to him. Her lips parted in a soft exhale, and he felt the weight of her gratitude. It seemed she was saying, "No. This is where I must stay." He bowed his head, accepting her decision. Some bonds transcended years, distance, even death. In that silent vow, Harlan understood that the fox's vigil was not over. It was only beginning, the next chapter in a story of compassion, memory, and the wild wisdom that binds us all. He rose slowly, casting one last look at the fox, and turned back toward home, knowing sleep might yet find him. But one thing was certain, he would return tomorrow. And the day after. Because the promise they shared, of kindness repaid, could not be broken by time or frost. And he, Harlan, would bear witness until her final breath. I decided it must have been a trick of the light. But when I stepped into the clearing at dawn, there she was, waiting still. On the second day, dawn arrived pale and brittle, the sky a wash of pewter over the silent woods. Harlan crept from his cabin before sunrise, each breath a plume of smoke in the still air. The clearing lay just as he'd left it, the cross standing sentinel over its snowy tomb, and the fox, curled against its base, her russet fur dulled by frost and blood. He paused at the edge of the clearing, the cold biting through his layers. The fox did not stir. Yet her eyes, those fierce, amber eyes, remained wide open, fixed on the grave marker. They glimmered with life, and, for a moment, Harlan felt the weight of her gaze press into him. She knew he was there. He slipped a bit forward, pulling 2 tins of sardines from his pack. He set one on a flat stone 30 feet away and the other closer, within a few paces of where the fox lay. The tin clinked softly in the hush. He stepped back, heart hammering, and watched her. For a long minute she refused the nearer tin, her head barely lifting. Then, with an effort that made her wince, she shifted forward and sniffed. Her ribs flexed beneath her matted coat. She ate sparingly, just a few fish at a time, then paused, drawing breath, every exhale a whisper of steam. Harlan swallowed and edged forward another several paces, crouching low in the snow. He kept his movements deliberate, respectful of the fragile truce between them. The fox glanced up, her gaze sliding to him and back to the tin. Recognition flickered in her eyes, as though she remembered the taste of kindness from years ago. He recalled Sam's first act of mercy, how, during one bitter winter night, the hunter had found a tiny fox kit limping toward a frozen stream. Its leg was mangled, blood caked in fur. Sam had knelt, his hands gentle as a mother's, and carried the kit back to camp. By the firelight, he had cleaned the wound, set a splint from saplings, and stayed up through the night, singing lullabies in a rough voice until the kit's breathing slowed to soft rhythms. Harlan had teased Sam about befriending a wild creature. Yet as days passed, the kit returned, sometimes a cautious glimpse at the edge of camp, other times bold enough to sit on a rock and watch Sam tend the fires and mend his nets. When the fox finally vanished, Sam had said she nodded goodbye before slipping into the pines. Now, more than a decade later, Harlan felt that same unmistakable spirit woven into the fabric of this wounded creature. The fox ate slowly, glancing at him each time she lifted her head. As the sun climbed, the feast diminished. She ate until her pain no longer allowed movement, then sank back to the snow, watching Harlan as he rose to his feet. He bowed his head, placing a hand over his heart, before turning and retreating toward the tree line. He paused by the cabin door and looked back. The fox lay motionless once more, her body curled tightly against the cross, as if drawing strength from its wooden embrace. He stepped inside and warmed himself by the stove, hands cupped around a mug of broth. Sleep remained elusive. His mind replayed the morning scene in a loop, the fox's cautious approach, the flicker of memory in her eyes, the way she nuzzled the tin before eating. He felt as though Sam's spirit hovered between them, guiding his every careful move. Night fell again, and Harlan sat by the window, drinking tea. Moonlight silvered the snow. His gaze drifted to the clearing, empty now but for the cross. Then he saw her emerge, slinking through the trees with deliberate grace, her body low. She halted at the edge of the grave, lifted her head, and studied the cross as though reading an ancient script. The wind carried the faint sound of her breath. She lingered there, unmoving, her silhouette thin against the moonlit snow. Harlan watched from the window, leaning so close the glass fogged beneath his brow. In that pale light, the contours of her face shone with quiet determination. He felt tears prick his eyes. When she finally turned and vanished into the dark, she left no tracks behind, not even in the fresh snow. The clearing lay untouched, the cross standing lonely against the night. Harlan closed the curtain, his heart pounding with wonder and worry. He wrapped himself in a blanket and tried to rest, but his thoughts circled back again and again to that silent vigil under the moon. He wondered how many nights the fox would return, what message she carried, and what bond tied her so irrevocably to this place. He dreamed of Sam, of that first winter's mercy, of the fox kit curled in Sam's lap, eyes bright with gratitude. He woke with a start, the room cold, and thought he heard a soft scuffle outside his door. At dawn he dressed and stepped onto the porch. The clearing lay before him, pristine and empty, no fox, no tracks, no blood. He felt his breath catch in his throat. Had it all been a waking dream? Had the fox's spirit simply been a mirage of grief and memory? He took a step forward, then another, until he stood at the threshold of the clearing. Snow glowed pink in the early light, and the cross cast a long shadow. But the fox was gone. Harlan shook his head, rubbing frost from his brow. He told himself it was over, that perhaps the fox had found rest elsewhere. But deep inside, he could not relinquish the certainty that she would be back. "I thought maybe she'd vanished at last," he murmured. But on the third day, on the third morning, a gale shrieked through the pines, whipping snow into frenzied spirals. The world beyond Harlan's cabin was buried under a shifting veil of white, yet in the heart of the clearing she remained, unyielding, silent, resolute. He fought his way along the beaten path, snow clawing at his boots, wind tearing at his coat. His breath came in ragged bursts, but his eyes were fixed on the cross. There, curled tight against its base, lay the fox, fur spattered with frost, blood dark beneath the ice. He paused 20 paces away, the roar of the storm muffling thought, and for a moment felt the weight of the entire forest pressing in. Then he took another step and another, until he came within arm's reach. He sank to the snow on one knee, wind buffeting him, and dared to speak. "I didn't think," his voice cracked on a gale-driven gust. "I didn't think you'd still be here." The fox lifted her head, ear pressed forward, her amber eyes tracking his every move. She did not growl or whimper. She did not even hobble away. She simply shifted to face him fully, as though recognizing a companion who had come to honor their vow. Harlan felt a tremor through his core, fear warred with awe. Part of him wanted to turn and flee, to leave this impossible scene behind. But a deeper part, some sacred remnant of wonder, kept him rooted to the spot. It felt as though he stood on holy ground. He remembered Sam's gentle hands on that broken kit, the care he'd lavished when the rest of the world would have shrugged and walked on. He remembered how the fox had repaid that kindness with unwavering loyalty, how she had returned day after day, no matter the season. And now, here she was again, drawn not by hunger, not by fear, but by something far older and stranger. Harlan's heart pounded. 100 voices in his head argued, "She's dying, help her," yet she came here for another reason. He laid a gloved hand on her shoulder but stopped himself from touching the wound. He could heal her no more. She did not ask for healing. She asked for remembrance. He sat down carefully in the snow, side by side with the fox. Ice lanced his skin through his clothing, but he did not move. She cocked her head and gazed at him with such stillness that he felt tears sting his eyes. He swallowed past the lump in his throat. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. "I could build a fire. Bring blankets. You could rest inside like old times." His cheek brushed a dribble of snow. "But you came here, not for warmth." The fox closed her eyes for a moment, as if in relief. When she opened them, she looked past Harlan to the cross itself, half buried in drifts. He followed her gaze and wondered if he had mistaken the forest for a chapel, the storm for canticles. He watched the wind scour her flank, wondered how much time she had left. Yet she sat without complaint, unmoving, an emblem of quiet dignity in the heart of the storm. Reluctantly, he rose to his feet. I'll let you be," he said, voice low. "I'll come back tonight." He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes from her. Behind him, the wind howled its mournful farewell. By evening, the storm had spent itself. Harlan crept back along the path, shoulders hunched against the slush and chill. He entered the clearing under a sky smeared with blood-red clouds. The cross loomed as always, and the fox lay in its shadow, body stark against the snow. He approached once more and knelt. The silence between them was charged, electric with unspoken understanding. She lifted her head briefly, then settled it back against the snow. He pressed his palm to his heart, closed his eyes. In that breathless instant, he felt the forest pulse around him, the heartbeat of snow-laden branches, the hush of ancestral stones, the faint echo of a fox's footfall long ago. He stood, brushing snow from his coat, and whispered, "I'll see you tomorrow." He left without looking back. He thought this was it. But on the fourth morning, a brittle hush lay over the forest. Harlan stepped outside his cabin, expecting to find the clearing still lit by dawn's pale glow, and a fox curled beside the cross. Instead, he found only snow untouched, smooth as glass. He frowned, heart tightening. He followed the footprints he'd come to know so well, boot prints from his cabin door, then the faint impressions of a fox's paws, weaving toward the trees, then suddenly vanishing. The snow beyond was pristine, as though no passage had ever occurred. He bent to inspect the trail. The paw prints led 12 paces into the underbrush and then stopped, as though the fox had been pulled underground. He stood and peered among the trunks, hearing only the wind rattling brittle branches. "Where did you go?" he whispered. His voice seemed to echo, a plea cast into empty air. He searched until the path of footprints was lost, then turned back toward the clearing, breath billowing in the cold. All day he waited in the cabin, staring out the frost-frosted window. Memories of the previous nights flared in his mind, the fox's steadfast vigil, her wounded body pressed against the cross, her eyes burning with resolve. He paced until his boots thudded hollowly on the floor. Hunger gnawed at him, but he could not find tears to taste on his tongue, only worry and a sense of betrayal by the forest itself. As dusk bled into night, he donned his coat and set out once more, lantern in hand. The woods seemed endless, each tree a silent sentry hiding secrets. When he reached the clearing, the circle of snow lay undisturbed, the cross stark against the dim sky. He set the lantern on a rock and called softly, "I thought you were gone for good." His voice carried across the snow, then died away. He knelt and brushed his gloved hand across the footprints of the night before. Nothing. No scent of fox, no hint of life. Fighting despair, Harlan stared into the gathering darkness. Then, beyond the cross, a shape moved. He froze, heart pounding, and watched as the fox stepped into the faint lantern glow. She held something in her jaws. His breath caught. She looked at him for an instant, eyes gleaming with that same silent knowing, then dipped her head and placed the object at the foot of the cross. Harlan rose, lantern trembling in his hand. He stepped closer. There, half buried in snow, lay a small white flower. Its petals were pristine, as though plucked only hours before from somewhere deep within the woods. He knelt and gingerly picked it up. It felt warm against his glove, impossibly vibrant amid the cold and decay. He pressed it to his chest. The fox remained motionless, watching him. Her breathing was slow, deliberate. He realized she must have carried that flower all the way from some hidden grove, braving her pain and the bitter cold to leave this gift. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the bloom spread through him. "I can't explain this," he murmured. "But I saw it with my own eyes." He stood and held the flower before the cross, placing it gently on the snow. In that moment, the world seemed to pause, snowflakes drifted like soft applause, the wind stilled, even the trees leaned in. All that remained was the fox's steady presence. Harlan faced her, voice cracking with awe. "I thought this was farewell," he whispered. "I thought you were gone." She lifted her head, amber eyes reflecting the lantern's glow, as though acknowledging his words. Then, without another glance, she turned and padded back toward the shadowed tree lean. Her footprints reappeared in the snow, leading away once more, then stopped at its edge, where only darkness awaited. He watched until she vanished. The flower lay bright and impossible in the snow at the foot of the cross. He knelt once more and bowed his head, overwhelmed by the fox's quiet devotion and the mystery of her gift. The lantern flickered, throwing dancing shadows across the clearing. Sweat chilled on his brow. His legs ached from kneeling. Yet he could not rise. He pressed his palm to the cold wood of the cross, feeling every knot and grain. "Thank you," he breathed. "For everything." Behind him, the wind sighed, a sound like a whisper of approval. He turned and limped back toward the cabin, the small white flower cradled like a miracle in his hand. He told himself this was the end of her vigil, the final token of remembrance, the last sign of her gratitude. But deep in his chest, Harlan knew it was not over. "I thought this was farewell," he repeated softly to the night air, but this was not all. On the fifth night, Harlan lay awake in his cabin, the wood stove's embers dimming to ash. His eyes were heavy but sleep refused to come. Instead, he found himself drawn to the window, where pale moonlight pooled on the snow like liquid silver. He watched the clearing, heart pounding with a restless hope that tonight the fox would return. Hours stretched thin. The wind had fallen silent, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Then, just before midnight, he saw her, a dark shape slipping through the pines. The fox moved with careful grace, as though she carried the weight of every memory in her bones. He watched her approach the grave, each step measured, each footprint a testament to her devotion. She settled beside the wooden cross with a soft exhalation that stirred the snow at her muzzle. She lay low, ribs rising and falling in the cold night air, eyes fixed on the memorial. To Harlan's unseeing gaze, it must have looked like a woman kneeling at a loved one's headstone, seeking solace in the silent communion of loss. Harlan opened the door without a sound, the cold biting at his face. He carried no lantern, he would not break this moment with light. He stepped into the snow and sat a respectful distance from her, knees drawn to his chest. Night deepened around them, wrapping them in hushed reverence. They shared the clearing like old friends reunited. Neither spoke. Neither moved. She did not huff or shift, she simply lay there as if her life depended on guarding this spot. And he did not stand or leave, he remained, rooted by something he could neither name nor refuse. The stillness pressed in so heavily that Harlan felt his own heartbeat echo in his ears. He thought of Sam, of the many nights they'd sat by the fire under this very sky, talking quietly of hunts and the odd miracle of a creature spared by mercy. He thought, too, of the fox Kit whose leg had been mended by human hands, and how that small act of kindness had rippled through years and seasons until it brought this wounded creature back to this hallowed ground. Harlan's breath trembled as he looked at her. In her eyes there was so much silence, an ocean of memories, of pain, of faith. She was both fragile and unbreakable, a paradox of nature's cruelty and compassion intertwined. And at that moment, he could no longer hold himself together. A single tear escaped down his cheek, carving a warm path through frost. He bowed his head, pressing his gloved hand to the earth between them. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could do more." The fox lifted her head, amber eyes glinting in the moonlight. She regarded him for a long beat, then lowered her muzzle to the snow once more. In that silent exchange, Harlan understood that her vigil was not born of sight or hunger, but of something deeper, a promise kept beyond the boundaries of life and death. He sat until the stars began to pale with dawn's approach, until the first fragile light brushed the horizon. Then, with his back stiff from the cold and his heart full of awe, he rose. He did not disturb her. He merely stepped away, casting one last glance over his shoulder. The fox remained where she lay, a silent guardian of memory and grace. As he crossed the threshold of his cabin, he thought this might be the final night of their shared vigil. But he knew, deep in his bones, that it was not yet over. On the 6th morning, the forest lay empty and still. Harlan rose before dawn, heart heavy with the memory of the fox's steady vigil. He stepped onto the porch of his cabin, expecting to see her silhouette curled beneath the familiar wooden cross. Instead, he found nothing but unbroken snow and silence. All day he wandered the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning for any sign of her, no tracks, no movement, no whisper of rustling fur. His chest felt hollow, as though a piece of him had been torn away. At nightfall, he kept watch through the window, but the moon rose and set without revealing her shape. On the 7th morning, the same emptiness greeted him. The world felt colder, the trees more distant. Harlan's breath shook as he trudged toward the grave. The snow crunched underfoot, echoing in the still air. He nearly stumbled over his own shoelaces as he neared the clearing and froze at what he saw. Fresh pawprints led from the forest edge to the cross, and small droplets of blood stained the snow, her blood. He knelt beside the tracks, trailing them with a trembling finger until they ended. His eyes blurred with tears as he realized, this was her final journey. He stood and surveyed the clearing. The cross stood sentinel over an empty bed of snow, unmarred except for those brief footprints. No body lay there. No sign of struggle. Only the hollow space where her vigil had unfolded. A hush settled over him, neither fearful nor mournful, but profound. He felt as if he had stepped into a sacred chamber where grief and gratitude had been laid bare. The emptiness was holy, charged with every moment the fox had spent at this spot, each hour she had borne her pain, each beat of her heart offering solace to a man she had never truly known. Harlan sank to his knees in the snow, bowing his head. He pressed his gloved hands against the earth where she had lain. He felt a warmth lingering in the frozen ground, as though her spirit still pulsed beneath the surface. He remembered every detail, the way her head had lifted when he approached, the way her eyes had shone with recognition, the soft exhale of breath that had mirrored his own. He remembered the trembling hope that each morning she would greet him once more, and the ache that had followed when dawn revealed emptiness instead. A sharp wind rattled the branches overhead, stirring loose snow into swirling motes around him. Harlan shivered but did not rise. He raised his gaze to the cross and imagined the fox's final glance, her last act of devotion. He pictured her walking that path through the pines one final time, every step a farewell, every drop of blood a testament to the promise she had kept. He closed his eyes against the sting of tears. "I thought you'd stay," he whispered. "I thought, but you had to go." A single sunbeam pierced the gray sky, illuminating the clearing in quiet glory. The snow sparkled like a sea of diamonds. For a moment, Harlan felt the weight of loss give way to something gentler, acceptance. He had witnessed a miracle of gratitude, a devotion that transcended fear and mortality. He rose slowly, brushing snow from his coat. His legs trembled, but his heart felt unburdened by grief. He laid one hand on the cross and, voice soft yet steadfast, spoke the words he knew would carry the power of their story beyond this frozen wood. If your heart is racing now, you feel it too. Then subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the truth. Harlan lingered a moment longer, eyes closed, as though listening for her silent reply. Then he turned and walked back down the path, leaving the clearing in its sacred stillness, knowing that, though her body was gone, the fox's vigil would echo in his soul forever. Harlan sat in the fading light of late afternoon, his breath curling in little spirals before him as he stared at the worn wooden cross. He replayed every moment of the past week in his mind, the first sight of blood on the snow, the fox curled at the foot of the grave, the tins of sardines left half-eaten in tender ceremony, the storms he'd weathered beside her silent vigil, and the small white flower she'd carried in her jaws. Each memory felt both impossibly vivid and somehow unreal, like a dream he could not wake from. Doubt gnawed at him. He whispered to the empty air, "Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe I imagined the stories I've told myself." His voice cracked with the weight of uncertainty. He argued with himself, a wounded fox surviving harsh winters. An animal returning night after night to the same spot. It all seemed beyond belief. Yet every time he thought of dismissing it, a chill ran down his spine, and he felt that familiar tremor in his chest. "Why do I get goosebumps just thinking about it?" he muttered under his breath. "Why do I still stand here, night after night, peering into the woods and waiting?" He shook his head, tears pricking at his eyes. He imagined the fox's amber gaze, wise and unwavering, and he knew he could never truly let go of this mystery. Before dusk settled fully, Harlan grabbed his lantern and wrapped himself in his heaviest coat. The sky was a slate gray, and the first stars blinked faintly overhead as he made his way through the snow toward Sam's grave. His steps were slow and deliberate, each crunch of snow underfoot echoing in the hush of the forest. The wind was calm tonight, a welcome reprieve after the storms that had battered the pines these past days. When he reached the clearing, the sight that greeted him was achingly familiar. The cross stood straight and unwavering, and at its base lay the faintest impression of a body in the snow. He held up the lantern and saw the outlines of where the fox had rested, a perfect shape pressed into the drifts. His heart tightened at the sight. He set the lantern down and sat on a nearby rock, pulled his cap low, and clasped his gloved hands together. The deepening twilight painted the clearing in shades of sapphire and gray. He closed his eyes and spoke aloud, as if Sam himself stood beside him. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said, voice soft in the stillness. "I don't know if she's really out there, or if I'm just a broken old man chasing ghosts. But I feel it in my bones, she came here for more than food or shelter. She came to say goodbye." He paused, his chest tight. The air was so cold that each breath felt like shards of ice on his tongue. Yet he felt no hurry to leave. The clearing felt holy, a sacred space carved out by grief and gratitude. Harlan took a deep breath, memories flooding back of Sam's gentle hands wrapping that broken fox kit in a blanket, of warm lantern light dancing in the dark, of the shy creature returning again and again to repay a kindness. He spoke as though addressing both friend and fox. "She came not for me," he said, voice quavering with emotion. "She came for you, Sam. Not to comfort the living, but to honor your spirit, her old friend who once saved her life." A hush settled over the clearing. In that moment, Harlan felt a presence, as if the forest itself acknowledged his words. He dared to lift his head and look into the tree line, half expecting to see the fox emerge. But there was only shadow and snow. He let his shoulders slump. Then, in a quiet resolve, he whispered, "I don't know what it was. But I'm not the same man I was a week ago. I understand now that animals feel more than we give them credit for. They understand kindness. They remember it. And they forgive." The lantern's glow flickered, casting long, wandering shadows across the snow. He stood and approached the cross, running a hand along its rough-hewn surface. The wood was cold, but beneath his glove he felt the warmth of memory, of moments shared between a fox and a hunter, two lives intertwined by compassion. He knelt and placed his forehead against the base of the cross, closing his eyes. His breath slowed as tears finally broke free, tracing warm paths down his cheeks. He thought of the fox lying there in her final vigil, of her courage in pain, and of the promise she had honored until her last breath. Rising, he retrieved a scrap of paper and ink from his coat pocket, something he'd carried on each visit but never used until now. With careful strokes, he scrawled a few words on the page, in memory of Sam, who showed mercy where others would not. In honor of the fox who returned to bid farewell. He tied the note to the cross with a piece of twine, then stepped back. The forest held its breath as a gentle breeze stirred the snowflakes. Harlan watched until the note snapped softly in the wind. Then he turned and began the long walk back to his cabin, the lantern's light bobbing like a heartbeat in the night. Back inside, he hung his coat by the door and stared at the empty hearth. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that the fox's spirit might still be watching over him. He thought of the countless times he had doubted, and of the unshakable conviction that had taken root in his heart. As he blew out the single candle he'd lit for Sam, his final words echoed in the quiet room. "I saw a wild fox, wounded and dying, come to the grave of the man who once saved her. She lay down beside him, silent and reverent. And if you think animals do not remember, you simply haven't seen this. But I have." He extinguished the candle's flame, leaving only the soft glow of moonlight through the window. In the darkness, he felt a profound peace settle over him, a peace born of witnessing something beyond explanation, beyond fear, beyond loss. And though the fox would no longer appear, her vigil had changed him forever. If you've ever encountered a miracle in the wild, right, animals remember kindness.